Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our March 24th virtual transit and transportation meeting. I pray that this is our last virtual meeting for committees for a very, very long time. But we will adjust accordingly. Today, we have one item. It is a carryover from our EDI committee connected to sidewalk expansions. So our staff will give us a presentation, and then we will go from there. We have no one signed up to speak. So after the presentation, we'll open up to our full back to council for discussion. Councilman Buffkin is excused today. He's absent and excused today from today's meeting. So at this time, I will turn it over to our Deputy City Manager, Tansy Hayward, to start the staff presentation.
Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. Michael Moore will be leading off the presentation today. You did have some information in the backup with the agenda. He'll be going through a presentation today, and then we do have a number of other city staff that are available if we get specific questions. So with that, I will hand the floor to Mr. Moore.
Good afternoon, and thank you. Again, I'm Michael Moore. I'm Transportation Director here in Raleigh. Do have a brief presentation for you here today. I do want to start by qualifying a little bit by saying the recommendation that came out of the DRA study was a little bit broad, a little bit open-ended. So what we have for you today is an opportunity really to maybe help guide and channel the discussion, and it'll be a fairly brief presentation. But before I start, I did want to give you a brief update also on kind of where we stand with the Streetery program that you have funded and made permanent. We have, as you know, we've got a number of locations that we have identified for potential Streetery installations. We have had a few fits and starts related to the contracting on that. We have done one bid where it exceeded the amount that we were eligible for an informal bid. We've done another bid that we're having a little bit of difficulty with our contractor getting some licensing in place. But I am happy to report we do have a path forward, and we will have them under contract here in the very near future to get a few of these started, and you'll start to see a few of these pop up on the street. So just wanted to give you that quick update in case you were wondering where that was. So bear with me. I have never shared a presentation in WebEx before, so we're going to give this a try. And if I mess it up, Mr. Chavis is going to help me out. So if someone can, please let me know if I've got that right, and you are only looking at one big title slide, and you're not looking at my massive email list of things.
You need to share your screen, sir.
It's a nice blue screen.
Right. Well, see, I told you this was going to be a bit of an issue here. So
Michael, I would take that down and try maybe again and see if it'll let you pick the screen itself.
I'm going to try this real quick. How about now?
Yep, that's it.
All right, thank you. Thanks for bearing with me on that. So again, this presentation really doesn't have any recommendations. It's a little bit about sort of explaining kind of what we have on the ground today and some potential table setting for our discussions later. Here's our brief agenda. We are going to walk through the public realm study recommendation just to review that in whole. Some of the current practices that we've got, expansion locations, potential where we might see this as being applicable, what public initiated process we have today, and then issues and considerations, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So again, just to review the public realm recommendation itself, it said study the potential for expanding the sidewalk width permanently in locations with sidewalk widths too narrow for seating currently as well as the potential for business or citizen-initiated processes to permanently expand the sidewalk width on a block-by-block basis in downtown. And I won't read the balance of it. I think you are all very familiar with it. But again, it talks about how we might be able to do this in lieu of other options like streeters. So how would we normally go about this today? So Raleigh can widen sidewalks in really two ways. That is through new development, where we're getting additional sidewalk width through that's either mandated through a frontage standard in the UDO or adopted streetscape plan. The street design manual, zoning overlays also give us that tool and mechanism. And in these cases, that's typically where we will widen into the parcel rather than into the street. For city-initiated projects, capital projects, Fayetteville is a good example. You all probably remember that way back in the early 90s, 80s. It was 4 lanes. Here is the case where we actually widen into the street and make those sidewalks wider. So that would be the option that we would pursue with capital projects where we can. And again, here's just a few examples of, again, a frontage standard that we would see in the UDO. Here's a copy of the Oberlin streetscape plan, that kind of cross section that gives guidance for that. And then I think, again, we're all familiar with what we see in Fayetteville Street. So typical expansion locations we would look at would include development, that new development where we would get new setbacks into the parcel, and Raleigh would have that control through that new right-of-way dedication or new easements. Where we would see expansion into the street would be some areas that are established where we would not likely see major new development. Historic areas where we want to preserve that fabric and the street frontage that's there today. And then there are some areas we know, for example, of an historic area, we might look at something like City Market in that area. Other areas we look at is places where we know we have public safety issues and operational concerns. And I think one we're all familiar with there would be Glenwood South, where we know that the sidewalk congestion and the crush of loads on crowds on Thursdays, Fridays, Saturdays make it really tough to do sidewalk dining in those locations. Some other things that we would want to think about, some potential limiting factors about expansion into the street would be just where we have large vehicle turning maneuvers around, say, Go Raleigh Station and potentially around the new Rust Bus location. We would want to be careful about how we have that where it's concurrent with an adopted bike route, where we want to do dedicated and protected bike lanes, where we have dedicated bus lanes. And then DOT streets are a special issue in that they require, again, from a moving vehicular lane, they're going to require a 6-foot offset for that before we would have dining. Generally today, that's provided by parking that's there, and that's the buffer that we get for that 6 feet. But if we were to move the dining out, we would have to find where that new 6 feet would come, and that would probably be into the travel lane. For processes, we currently have no way for a citizen to petition us about doing these sidewalk expansions on their own. Our options are limited to our streetery program, and again, we've done a lot of great work through you to help make that a permanent option for folks. We would get that through development plans when folks came in to do that redevelopment, or through potentially a custom streetscape petition. For city processes, I think it is important for us to recognize wherever we can, this is a goal that we see to help maximize and optimize that pedestrian environment. So we, as staff, as we're developing projects and we're looking at things, we're always looking to see where we can take sidewalk out to its most optimal width and location. A great example of that is the work that happened in Hillsborough Street a few years ago. You can see this example here where we were able to, again, shrink that street and create a better safety issue and actually incorporate some other uses like green infrastructure into that wider sidewalk space. So we're wrapping up. So here, just some things that we want to think about as we're doing this, how we go about balancing sidewalk uses with other business curbside needs, loading, parking, et cetera. And we are all very familiar with that. Those trade-offs that we might have between a permanent use and other high priority uses, again, like protected bike lane. Of course, we know that there are construction issues. We'd have to deal with how drainage works. Some streets have steeper crowns, slope and crowns than others. the cost issues that would be there, and then, what are the impacts to overall streetscape? For example, if we move the curb line 6 feet out into the street and assume the parking areas, but we want to move all the street trees too. And again, that goes back to cost and how we create consistency from the streetscape point of view. For those public initiated processes, clearly we'd have to define how we would go about funding and constructing those, and where those would sort of fit into like the bigger set of priorities for the city. Would, if it was privately funded, if we were approached by an individual or a business and said we wanted to do this, would we have provisions to reimburse them were we ever to find it necessary to remove that? Just things to think about. And then what would be that funder's expectations of the control of that space? Again, we want to make sure that it's good quality public space and is available to everyone, but they might have a different expectation for that. Touched on that NCDOT permitting and the clear zones before. There's also with NCDOT for federal aid routes, and all of our streets that are NCDOT downtown are on the federal aid route. There's a fair market value reimbursement that's required. And then lastly, we'll just, is there an alternative that we might improve our current streetery program to create, a sort of a more semi-permanent approach without having to do those serious and costly, more permanent modifications. So with that, we'll open it up for discussion. Would love to hear your input and get your feedback on this. Mr. Chavis, rather than me bungle through this again, would you please help me pull the presentation down? And thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Michael, for the information, the presentation. I think you definitely show that, one, we have processes in place for anything other than a request, a business coming up and saying, hey, we want to widen the sidewalk in front of our business. Normally it's done by a redevelopment process. I wanted to open this up to my fellow council members for questions. And I know this came out of EDI. So I am looking into Councilman Milton as well as chair of that committee. Questions and comments that you may have.
Yeah, I have some comments. Doing this historically as part of a development or a redevelopment almost seems a little reactionary. And I think would be great if we could take a little bit of a proactive approach on it. And I would think that we would want two sort of concurrent streams. One, probably develop a process so that the private sector can request the expansion, since we don't have that process in place right now. And then two, I think it would make sense for staff to proactively come back to council and say, here are some areas we think that would make a lot of sense for us to look at funding an expanded sidewalk. And at that time, I think we would have the discussion about how does it interact with other forms of multimodal transportation and transit and maybe that's something staff thinks about. We're not going to put a protected bike lane here because it's not part of our bike plan, and we're not going to put a bus lane here because it's not part of the Wake County Transit Plan. So that may factor in. So what I'd like to do maybe is refer this back to council with the request for staff to come up with the petition program so the private sector can ask for it, and then a proactive approach of coming back to us with maybe a couple corridors that they think this would make sense.
So a question I have, the first one is from a petition standpoint. Say we have a business that is mid-block that may want an expanded sidewalk. I think about things like that. If it's mid-block, they want to do it, but they're mid-block of the entire street. That impact. Those are some of the things I think we really need staff to figure out before we say come up with a plan. Because I would hate for us to come with a plan, but there are certain legal matters that may prevent it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I had thought of that too, because it would be weird if just like one storefront has like a sidewalk that's pokes out. I don't think that, I had thought if we had recommended that staff come up with a plan that be part of the consideration, because that may have to be considered, right? But I think what may be tough too is, we have a petition system for sidewalks, but we can never fund the sidewalk construction. And I also don't want to get into a situation where we are creating an expectation of petition system for expanded sidewalks, and we either can't practically do it for the issue that Councilmember Branch raised, or we don't have the funding for it. So actually that makes me pause on that piece of it a little. I think it may still be worth having staff, empowering staff or authorizing that to try to take a stab at it, so to speak. But I'm really interested in the proactive approach of where do we think this makes sense, come to us with those recommendations while considering the other competing policy interests of multimodal transportation and transit, because we're competing for the same right-of-way space. And you know, taking this one step further, that's where I think we should be with our sidewalk program too. So that's kind of where I'm at. I definitely think we should move forward on the authorize staff, or recommend to the full council that we authorize staff to proactively identify some areas to do this. Kind of 50-50 on whether we want to take a shot at the petition.
Right.
If I could ask a couple of clarifying questions on the petition program, and I think you were touching on this, whether the intent is that those would be a petition process to allow private funding of those, or whether again it would be creating a public funding process. We certainly could share. The city does have processes to request encroachments, and that could be modified to allow a private entity to make a request to make private investments into the right of way that we could certainly help. But I do think the question of funding, if the expectation was city funding being aligned to that, we would want to have a longer term conversation with the council about funding levels and source and competition with existing sidewalk priorities. With regard to the question on your study is currently, and Michael could speak to this, or members of planning, the city does do area plans and corridor plans, which do outline areas with aspirational goals for broader sidewalks. With the scope of your request, is this the downtown footprint, or is this a citywide assessment that you're requesting? Because I do think defining what the scope would be would influence what resources we would recommend to you that would need to be brought to bear on a planning exercise of that nature.
Councilor Melton.
We could have kept this in EDI. Sorry, I'm doing all the talking. You know, this originated from the Downtown Raleigh Alliance Public Realm Study. So I'm certainly not trying to play geographical favorites, but I think it makes sense for this, the focus of this to be for downtown. And this came out of the DRA Public Realm Study. And I think that's where it makes the most sense, because that's where we're really seeing the concentration of the streeteries. Yes.
Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry.
Very good.
Chairman, with your permission.
Right.
You know, as the deputy city manager mentioned, we do a number of area and corridor studies, and I would respectfully suggest maybe one of our first steps is to take a step back and let us go through those area studies, and particularly those that are in and around the downtown area, and see what we find in terms of recommendations there. That may be, I think, a good first step for us to see where we might have applicability to those sidewalk expansions. We may already be contemplating that through those area studies.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Chair. Michael, that makes a lot of sense to me. Where my brain goes on this is back to the downtown study we did a number of years ago, I think before my time, maybe Councilmember Branch was on when that downtown study was complete. And what we were talking about between then and pre-pandemic was actually more conflicts around ADA and that sort of accessibility on some of our more narrow sidewalks, as that clashes with wanting to get restaurants some use of the sidewalk for tables and chairs. So I think this is a long time continuation of that work. And I think having staff go back and look at that and figure out where are some of these real pinch points in downtown would be super helpful. And then correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we also have a larger conversation coming back to full council around sidewalks regarding petitions and prioritization.
Right.
So I think that kind of helps balance all of this out. But I would be very comfortable with Councilmember Melton's suggestion around having staff go back and look at this stuff and bring back some priority areas for us to consider. I'm hesitant on a petition program for exactly the reasons you all both brought up.
Question two for Director Moore. Is it policy that whenever we pave a street or restripe a street now to add bike lanes?
Council member, we look at that as an option. Yes, we try to do that. But we try to do that in accordance with the bike plan. We don't do it on every single street, but we try to do it where the bike plan has identified that need.
Okay, so and I brought that up because I think as we're looking into this and asking for that review of just looking at plans, to keep the bike plan in mind too, because that's where we will have, like you stated in the presentation, some conflict potentially. And then our great friends, I'll be seeing some of them next week on the trip on transportation, NCDOT. Dealing with conflicts there as well. I think that you brought out in the presentation. So I think having that information, I think will be helpful. And I think I could be, agree for us to look into just having staff go back, look at what options or possibilities there for future moving forward. And then at some point, we'll have the information, decide what next steps. Next steps maybe we have information and there's nothing to act on, or there may be something that comes out of that we can try to make some modifications. Because I realize you're also, as we talk about this, you're putting down, BRT, downtown on some streets that we were going to convert, that we had to put that on hold. So that we could figure out the best path for bus rapid transit and leaving the downtown corridor. Which has a major impact on sidewalks as you do some station planning downtown. So, Councilman Milton, I think we've kind of come to a point where we will probably need a motion for your recommendation outside of a petition.
Okay, so then I move that we recommend to council that we authorize staff to do an analysis, corridor analysis or study of where these expanded sidewalks may make sense, and to come back with recommendations that we can consider.
Okay, that's been properly seconded by our Mayor Pro Tem. All those in favor, raise your hand. Mr. Clerk, that passed unanimously. All right. Is there anything else? We have no pending items. So since I have you all, I just want to see if there's anything that anyone may have that's related to transit that was referred to us in some way that council won't throw us in jail for mentioning today. See, Brandon, how I kept us out of trouble? Councilor Milton.
I actually just had a follow-up question. Mr. Moore's comment about the streeteries, is that appropriate to ask?
Well, he brought it up, so yes.
I know I'm getting questions about some folks have the yellow and orange and white temporary barriers, and asking, are we looking at those areas as a priority first for the streetery, or what will be the timeline on having to maybe replace them with something that looks a little more permanent? That was my question.
So yes, we are prioritizing. As soon as we have that contract in place, that was something that we've got identified in the contract to go first. Selfish motive, we are renting those barricades. It would be advantageous for us to be able to get those, to get a more permanent and a more aesthetic solution there, so we can get the orange and white barricades out and I can get them back to the supplier. So.
Cool. All right. Thank you. I want to thank everyone. Thank you those who have watched. Thank you, staff. 2 years, virtual meetings. Who would have thought it? And I think, honestly, I don't know the exact, but I think we were probably one of the first committees to actually go virtual. And we're the last. So everyone have a great rest of your day. And I look forward to seeing your all smiling faces in the month of April. Take care. Bye.